So, ladies and gentlemen, the Supreme Court just handed President Trump a major ruling. Let's get into this. This is dealing with presidential power, independent agencies, and the federal bureaucracy of it all. And so what I'm talking about is this case that centers around Rebecca Slaughter, who is the commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission. And Trump fired her after returning to office. Now, this case came down to a very simple question, ladies and gentlemen. That being, if the president is elected by the American people to run the executive branch, can powerful officials inside executive agencies operate like they are untouchable? Can they sit inside the government, push an agenda, block presidential priorities, and then hide behind independent agency when voters demand different direction? And the Supreme Court basically said no. Now, the media, they want to frame this like Trump was just given a green light to fire random people because he woke up angry. But this is not what this is really about. This is about agency power, unelected officials, and ultimately whether the administrative state answers to the president, or is it the other way around, or even something else. And so, as always, smash that thumbs up button. That's the best way to let me know you enjoy the content. For more, subscribe to the channel. Let's start right here.
That has to do with the ability of the president to remove members of independent federal agencies without cause. All right, so hang on one moment. Here's the headline. The U.S. Supreme Court has declined to allow the president to remove Lisa Cook from her job. Remember, they argued that, the allegation was that she committed private mortgage fraud, but that case, however, had not been concluded, I don't believe, in proving that she had. Now, with regard to the other case, the court does back the president's firing of the Federal Trade Commission member. Now, that had to do with a case by the name of a woman, Rebecca Slaughter, and the question was whether or not the president had the power to take independent federal agencies, the heads of those agencies, off of their job without cause. You know, Professor, it sounds like there's a bit of a contradiction the way I'm reading it. Go ahead and clarify it. Lisa Cook can keep her job, but others like Rebecca Slaughter cannot.
Well, at issue in this case, obviously I've not read the opinions as it just came out, but at issue in the case was a rather old and established precedent called Humphrey's Executor. And in that decision, the Supreme Court said that Congress could create a type of hybrid creature within the executive branch, could create a commission that the president cannot dictate who are members of, can remove those members. It barred that. It said that, in fact, Congress could create one that insulated the members from a sitting president. That has always been controversial because many scholars and many judges have said, look, you don't see any of that in the Constitution. There's no hybrid animals. There's no legislative branch, an executive branch, a judicial branch. So if they ruled against Slaughter and in favor of the administration, that would be a significant increase in executive power.
In Trump v. Slaughter, can you explain what that was and why it's a blow to the administrative state and unelected bureaucrats not being held accountable?
This is a very important decision, possibly will end up being the most important decision of this whole term. It says that the president is in charge of the executive branch, and we don't have a fourth or fifth branch of government. And so all of these alphabet agencies, the FTC, the FCC, the NLRB, the SEC, all of these things, the president has to be able to remove the members of these boards, the commissioners, and so forth. This overturns a 90-year-old precedent. The court has been hinting at that incrementally for the last 15 years, called Humphrey's Executor, and they got it absolutely right. The president is now in control of these agencies, and that is right for democratic accountability. If you don't like something that the FTC is doing, you can now blame the president.
Well, I completely agree with Lisa that this is a sky is falling moment, because we have now seen the Supreme Court enshrine the unitary executive theory, overturn Humphrey's Executor, and I think perhaps destroy the deep state as Donald Trump calls it, which I call the professional civil service, and perhaps a return to what we saw before 1883 when Congress passed the Pendleton Act, a return to a spoil system where the president cleans house. We no longer have professional career experts in these positions, but the president's cronies who are there to serve his political aim.
And so here's what people need to understand about how these agencies worked before this ruling. These were not just random federal employees. We are talking about powerful officials inside a so-called independent agency. Many of them were nominated by a president, confirmed by the Senate, and then placed into long, staggered terms that were designed to outlast whichever president was currently in office. And so even if the American people voted for a new president with a new agenda, that president could end up being stuck dealing with agency officials from the previous political era. Now, before this ruling, the president could not just simply go on and remove certain commissioners just because they disagree with his policy direction. No, that's not how it worked. The law said they could only be fired for specific causes like inefficiency, neglect of duty, or misconduct in office. Now, on paper, that sounds like independence, what you want, independent agency, right? But the reality is that can turn into insulation from accountability, because if these agencies have real power, if they're out here regulating, enforcing, investigating, punishing, and shaping policy, right? Then the question becomes, think about it. Who do they answer to? Now, the media wants you to believe this is about Trump wanting unchecked power, but the bigger issue is, should unelected officials inside the executive branch, that's the key here, is the executive branch, should they be allowed to work against the elected president's agenda and be protected from removal? But let's continue.
So, Lisa, this basically sets the precedent now that you can fire an independent regulator at will. If they're not doing your bidding effectively as president of the United States, you can just get rid of them. That overturns 90 years or so of precedent there. But they do make this carve out for now for the Federal Reserve. What's the distinction between the two?
Well, I can tell you what the justices say the distinction is, and then we can talk about what the real distinction is, if any. One of the things that happened here is that Donald Trump did not contest the constitutionality of the statute that binds him to only fire members of the Federal Reserve for cause. He seemed to accept that that was a given, and then the only question for the court was, what does it mean to fire a member of the Federal Reserve for cause, and had he done it here? But really, there is no distinction, Willie, and Justice Barrett points that out in a dissent in the Cook case. She says, how can the court on one hand announce a new categorical rule and on the other breath say, here's the exception to that rule? And if you look at the various opinions here, one thing that I think is striking is there are only two justices who are in the majority in both cases. Chief Justice Roberts, who is fighting for the court's institutional life, basically, in every decision, and Justice Kavanaugh, who has gone out of his way time and again to say, in so many words, the Fed is different. That's not an explanation that carried weight with 7 of the justices who in a variety of ways have said, I don't know how to square this circle. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And the other thing that I want to point out about the Slaughter opinion, that's the opinion through which they have said the president now has the power to fire members of independent agencies or these multi-member commissions. If you read Chief Justice Roberts' opinion in that case, one of the things that is really scary about it is it's not just about independent agencies. It suggests that the president has the constitutional authority to fire any subordinate, meaning he doesn't just have the power to fire Rebecca Slaughter. He might have the power to fire somebody like Maureen Comey, a career prosecutor here in the Southern District of New York, who was fired basically by a letter that says, pursuant to Article 2, you're fired, right? And if that is what the court is saying here or setting the ground for, that means we're not just talking about the evisceration of independent agencies. We're talking about the eradication of the civil service writ large. That is an enormously terrifying proposition at a time where this administration has really hollowed out lots of executive agencies, not only with respect to those people who are appointed, but also with respect to scores and hundreds of lawyers, as our colleagues Carol Leonnig and Ken Delanian have reported with respect to, for example, the FBI or the DOJ.
All right, and so a few things, because the way that the liberal media is framing this is they're saying this means that Trump can fire anyone who won't do his bidding. But that's not really the core issue right here, ladies and gentlemen. The core issue is whether powerful officials inside executive agencies, should they be able to operate with real government authority while being protected from the elected president? Now, to be fair, there is a legit concern here that we got to address. And that's the fact that any power given to one president, that means the next president has that power too. So, I mean, that's the reality of the situation. So, yes, if a Democrat wins in the future, they may use the same authority to clean house in the opposite direction, right? Like if somehow America ever elected a socialist, we could be in for a different situation. Check this out.
I mean, look, you give it, then you take it. The reason you traditionally presidents didn't go there was that from a business marketplace standpoint, you don't want sharp swings. So you don't want, for instance, the Federal Trade Commission. Let's say a socialist is our next president. I'm being serious. And they just blow out the entire commission and they put in people who are like, we are going to go break up companies, right? Just outright, the pitchforks are out. And on January 21st, everyone is fired and they're in. You don't want that. You don't want these sharp swerves. Well, the flip side to it is, how do you have an independent agency in the executive branch? Like ultimately, it was kind of untenable because you would answer to the chief executive of that branch.
I mean, yeah, that could end up happening in the future. That's the flip side of this reality that has to be acknowledged with this ruling. But now let's go ahead and jump into the interview with Rebecca Kelly Slaughter, who was the FTC commissioner who was fired and brought this case to the Supreme Court. Check it out.
Out front now for an exclusive primetime interview, Rebecca Slaughter, the former FTC commissioner fired by Trump, who brought the Supreme Court case against him. I appreciate your time, Rebecca. So how much power do you think that this ruling now gives Trump?
A massive amount of power. I mean, the president said it himself. It is the largest expansion of executive power in over 100 years, and that is exactly why we should be worried about it.
So, the court did hand Trump a number of defeats today, including a ruling, interestingly, that he can't fire Lisa Cook at the Fed. Why do you think your case, which obviously involved the FTC, is different?
Well, I don't really think that it is different. I think it came out differently, and there were only 2 justices who ruled against me and for Governor Cook at the Fed. And I find it very hard to square those 2 decisions from any kind of rational, intelligible standpoint. The only difference that I can ascertain is that the Supreme Court and those 2 justices who switched the positions in those cases decided that there is a Wall Street exception. And that is exactly part of the problem. I mean, the FTC, it sounds like part of the alphabet soup of agencies, but it's the agency Congress set up to be bipartisan, multi-member, and independent in order for it to be able to check the most powerful corporations in the country and keep them from getting ahead by cheating and lying to the American people and enriching themselves at the people's expense.
Nobody is saying the FTC should not go after corporations that cheat, lie, scam the consumer, or abuse their power. Of course. I mean, yeah, they should be doing that. But protecting consumers from corporations does not mean creating an agency that is then protected from the voters. Ladies and gentlemen, if these commissioners have the power to regulate, investigate, sue, shape economic policy, they're exercising real government power. And if they are exercising executive power, they cannot operate like they are above the elected executive, which is the president. Because once you say these people are independent, which is the thing here, independent agency, the next question is, independent from who exactly? But let's continue.
And so for working people who depend on agencies like the FTC and the other independent agencies, the Supreme Court has said, no, we will not have that independent check. You will not be watchdogs anymore. You will be lapdogs. But for the Fed, which has some responsibility for Wall Street, the Supreme Court has said, okay, but you can stay as a watchdog. And I think that that's really problematic.
So Chief Justice John Roberts wrote for the majority, and he wrote, Rebecca, in the ruling, and I quote him, "The president must have the assistance of officers he can trust. Although it is up to the Senate to decide whether to confirm those with whom the president would prefer to work, neither Congress nor the courts may saddle with him with those with whom he cannot work. Subordinates who exercise the president's power are subject to removal by him." And it continued. But what do you make of that argument that Trump won the election and he gets to pick anyone appointed and get rid of those he doesn't like?
Yeah, so that's essentially the theory of the unitary executive. It's a theory to which Chief Justice Roberts has been an adherent for a very long time. But I think it is inconsistent with both the constitutional system of checks and balances, which says that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed, not that he shall do whatever he wants as a matter of policy. He has to execute laws as passed by Congress, and those laws set up both the structure of these 8 government agencies and give them substantive powers. It's also inconsistent with the historical tradition of our country dating all the way back to the founding, when the sinking fund, which Justice Sotomayor talked about in her dissent, had officers who could not be removed. And the common thread in these agencies that Congress set up with these limited removal protections is that they're there to protect economic integrity. So that the same way independent directors on corporate boards keep a CEO from just giving out favors to friends at the expense of shareholders, these agencies were designed to protect American taxpayers and American people from crony capitalism.
I'm going to leave it right here. The left is making a big deal out of this right now because it's President Trump. Because in the next election cycle, please believe, if it swings the other way and a Democrat president starts removing Trump-appointed regulators, the same people crying threat to democracy today will suddenly discover 101 reasons why it is necessary. They'll say elections have consequences. They'll say the president deserves people who supports the administration's agenda. They'll use whatever logic they can to validate their reasons behind now being okay with it. But here's where this ruling really does get really messy for me. The courts say Trump can remove FTC-style independent regulators and other different agencies, but then they also turned around and said the Federal Reserve, that's something different. That's off limits, basically. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand the argument. Feds control monetary policy, interest rates, inflation, market stability, and you do not want every president manipulating the central bank for political gain. But for me, constitutionally, that creates a real problem. If these individuals do not have to answer to voters, and they do not have to answer to the president the voters elected, then once again, the question becomes, exactly who do they answer to? That's just my thoughts and the update. Now, I want to hear from you. Drop your comments down below. I appreciate when you guys chime in. Don't forget you enjoy the content. Smash that thumbs up for more. Subscribe to the channel. And as always, until next time.